Now look, I already know you've been trying to draw more action poses. You've been spending nights, days and nights trying to draw this single pose, but every time you draw it, it looks more stiff than the previous. How does that even work? Now don't even worry about it. That's why I'm here. I'm gonna help you, guide you to make your poses look more dynamic.
Hey yo, wait, hold on. The tutorial is not going anywhere. I just want to take the time to address the fact that we have reached 400 subscribers. I want to thank you guys, really. I want to thank you guys. I truly am grateful. Who would have thought, after telling you guys over and over constantly to hit the subscribe button, who would have thought that we'll get to these numbers? The day will come when the double empire, the vibe, the energy, the whole double empire will just be unmatched. But we just have to work slowly and steadily to that time, right? We just have to work bit by bit. We'll get there. Just give us time. They are not ready for us. So again, I want to thank you guys, and I want to remind you each and every time, make sure to hit the subscribe button if you have not, to join the double empire. We're now trying to get to 500 subscribers, half a K. Tell your friends, tell your family of what we do here, of who we are and what we do here, alright? Now let's get started with this tutorial. Alright, as I'm busy with this tutorial, I have something in the back just for visual purposes. You can have this in the background. I strongly suggest on actually focusing visually on the video. But if you think you're bougie and all that, you can have this playing in the background. Just make sure that you're focusing. Now let me hit y'all with a quick Google search. Just a quick Google search so we understand what we're doing, right? Let's search up dynamic, right? There are two definitions. I'm gonna read both of them. First one says, a process or system characterized by constant change, activity, or progress. That doesn't really make that much sense to us artists, so we're going to jump to the next one. Of a person, positive in attitude and full of energy and new ideas. Let's cut that definition a little bit more. Full of energy. That's what we're going to focus on, this definition of dynamic. You got to pose, and to make it dynamic, you have to understand that that pose has to be full of energy. Now chill. I'm not calling you stupid. I'm not saying that you don't understand what dynamic pose means. I'm just saying that even these definitions, right? Even this act of fully understanding to the T what we're trying to do will help in improving drawing. Or at least it helped me. This act of truly understanding what dynamic means, right? It helped me understand that any pose, whatever pose that it is, any pose can be full of energy. Any pose can be dynamic. Now, there are mainly two types of poses. There are idle poses and they are motion poses. Now, idle poses are just simple standing still poses, you know, the poses that models will strike up when they're in a photo shoot, or the poses that artists will use when they're designing a character, coming up with a character sheet. These are just simple standing poses that will show the energy, however much it is, of the character that they're designing. Now, motion poses are the poses that characters or people will take when they're in the middle of doing something, when they're in motion. It's in the name. It's a pose that's taken while they're in motion. Photographers will take these poses while athletes are doing something, or artists will draw whatever character it may be, superhero, animated, whatever it may be. They're gonna draw these poses of the character busy doing something, punching someone, getting punched by someone. Although yes, you go on an app or a website like Pinterest and you search up for dynamic poses, they're gonna give you these motion poses, right? Because ideally these motion poses are more dynamic than the idle poses. But it's important to understand that both the idle and the motion poses can still be dynamic. It's just that one shows more energy, can be more or is more dynamic than the other. So there are three things to consider, three things to keep in mind when you're trying to make whatever pose it is that you're drawing full of energy, whatever pose it is that you're drawing more dynamic. First thing, line of action. You may have heard of this before. It's basically an imaginary line that comes from the bottom of the head and follows straight through the spine down to the bottom of the character. The second thing is the shoulders and hips placement. Like there's a line that connects both your shoulders and both your hips, right? And depending on how these two lines are placed, this will show the amount of energy in the character, and will increase or decrease it depending on how you place them. Now, the third thing is the general shapes that you would use to create the characters, to create them in the poses, idle or motion. Listen, we got the 2 types of poses, and we got the 3 things that affect the amount of energy that will be in that pose, that affect how dynamic the pose is going to be. Before I show you how these things going to affect the poses, I need to remind you, this is how we got to 500 subscribers, and I need to remind you to make sure we get to the next set, the next 500, half a K. Make sure to drop that like for us. And if you have not, hit the subscribe button to join the Double Empire. We do many things here. We do art tutorials like the one you're watching now, and we do many art challenges like my outfit redraws, which you should watch. This is an art channel with good vibes, so don't be shy, man. Hit the subscribe button. Okay, let's continue. Now, when you're looking at the line of action in an idle pose, right, you're basically looking at the way the spine is positioned in that pose. Now, when you have someone standing up completely straight, the spine is completely straight, 90 degrees to the ground, they don't look like they have that much of a personality, They don't look like they have that much energy. They look like a boring dude, you know what I'm saying? Now, to change that, just slant the spine a little bit. Give a little bend to that line of direction. Give a little bend to that line of action, to the point where the hips are sticking out in a certain direction. Usually character designers like to make the hips stick out in front of them, right? Stick out in front of them. So the line of action, the spine will be slanting, making that hip stick forward. That's a thing that's usually done. But you can make it stick out sideways, even backwards. Sometimes even backwards. Can still add that amount of energy that you may be looking for in that pose. Slant the spine a little bit. Sometimes the person can even be standing straight, right? But they're still showing energy because the spine can also be curved, puffing the chest, Superman type pose, when they're puffing out the chest, the spine is curved right there. You can even curve the spine sideways to have more of a feminine type pose, Show that energy by changing that line of action. Don't make it straight, Slant it, curve it, play a little bit with it. Now, the next thing that makes a pose more dynamic is the shoulders and hip placement. Now, there's the shoulder line and the hip line. To add a little more of that energy that you're looking for, don't make these lines parallel, when the character is standing. Don't make the hip line and the shoulder line parallel. Slant both of them, or slant one, that they are not parallel. The more parallel these lines are, the less dynamic a pose will be. But don't overdo it. You have to find that balance, otherwise you're punishing your poor character, whoever you're drawing. Now, the last thing that affects how dynamic a pose will be is the general shapes that you will use in constructing the character, right? Now, in the past tutorials, I know I've talked about general shapes that you can use to, for example, construct the forearm, to construct the torso, to construct the leg. But in this case, I'm talking about general shapes that you can use to construct the whole body itself. The whole body itself can be generalized. General shapes can be used to construct the whole character. Now, let's say a character is generally drawn with circles, right? That character is more of a friendly, bouncy, soft, welcoming, happy type character, A character is drawn with more squares. The general shape in the whole character shape is square, right? This shape shows more stability, trust, stubbornness, and by the book type energy, When you come to the triangle, you got edginess, danger, intense, speed type energy, The triangle is usually made to construct characters that, quote unquote, follow their own rules. They make up their own rules. It shows how not by the book compared to the square that is by the book, and compared to the circle, which is more soft. That the triangle shows more energy, more danger, and the triangle is used to create more dynamic poses. Now, what I explained is basically a rough introduction to designing characters, to character design, There's a video linked in the description that helps you out more with understanding the general shapes and all that. And if you want, maybe in the future, maybe in the near future, depending on how much you want it, I can maybe make a video introducing the novice artist, right, to character design. But let's focus on what we're doing right now. When you use the triangle to roughly make and structure the pose that you're trying to draw, you make this pose more dynamic. Now, you can have the whole pose in the triangle, or you can break up parts of the body I usually like to break up from the waist up into a triangle and the waist down to a triangle. I usually like to group the legs a lot into the triangle to have that nice wide stance, you know. This makes an idle pose more dynamic. I bet those are the three things, right? The line of action, the shoulders and hip placement, and the triangle as a general shape. Those are the three things that makes a pose more dynamic. How they usually make the idle pose more dynamic. Let's go over how they make the motion pose more dynamic. These three things are mainly used to make poses more dynamic, like the motion pose is mainly referred to when you search up dynamic poses, especially the line of action, because the line of action can be generalized. In motion pose, it can be quoted as the flow of energy in the pose, right? That line coming straight from the bottom of the head through the spine and down to the bottom of the character. You want to have this flow of energy more curved, right? Compared to the idle pose where that line of action would sometimes be slanted. When a line is slanted, there's not a there's not a nice flow of energy. There's that sharp flow of energy that can end up breaking that line, you know? So in a motion pose, it's always good to keep that line of action most of the time. I don't want to say it's impossible because I've seen the artists do the impossible. But anyway, most of the time, that line of action, keep it curved to show that nice, smooth flow of energy. Someone is flying with their puffed out chest, curve that line of action to show that puffed out chest. If someone is curling as they're rolling or as they're flipping, show that line of action to show how the spine is curving, you know? Now, because ideally the limbs are connected to the main body, right? The spine, the line of action. You can sometimes even have one of the legs following this line of action while the other one is doing its own thing. You can have one of the legs following this line of action. You can have both of them following this line of action, or you can have all of the limbs, arms and the legs following this line of action. This is ideally how you would draw Spider-Man swinging from building to building. Although the pose is still dynamic, the more limbs that follow this line of action, the more limbs that follow this flow of energy, the less dynamic a pose will be. If both of the legs are following this line of action, for example, person just looks like, for example, they are flying or they are standing up straight. But if one of them is following this line of action while the other one is doing its own thing, the pose looks like it has more energy. The pose looks more dynamic. Now, the second thing is the shoulder line and the hip line placement. These two are hardly ever parallel in a dynamic pose. Unless the character is flying, these two are hardly parallel in a dynamic pose. There will even be some cases where one has rotated more on the spine than the other. They are both still not parallel, but one has rotated more on the spine than the other. For example, a person, let's say, flying while they're punching, right? The shoulder is in front while the other shoulder is at the back, while the hip line is relatively still straight. That shoulder line would have rotated a bit more on the spine than the hip line. The less aligned these lines are going to be to each other, the more dynamic the poses are going to be. And for that last thing, that shape generalization, you want to use the triangle a lot to generalize the shape of the whole pose. Break down the pose with a triangle. Make the whole pose up with a triangle. I usually like to group the legs, not on again with the idle poses, but also in the motion poses. If I can, I'll try to use a triangle for the whole pose, right? Try to group the whole pose in a triangle, right? And then I break down their pose, drawing from the waist up and from the waist down, grouping them into triangles. I try to group the legs in a general triangle. I try to group from the waist up into a general triangle, if I can. Now, here are some tips that help me make my poses more dynamic, right? The first tip is to push it, right? Usually what I like to do is, after drawing a pose, after getting the pose, while keeping the three things in mind that make a pose more dynamic, I try to push that pose to the extreme. I'll make the line of action a little more curved. I'll make those shoulder lines and those hip lines rotate a little more, keeping them less parallel than they already were, even though they were not parallel to begin with. And those general shapes, you know, those triangles that I would use to construct the whole pose, I make the bases even wider. Try to push it to the extreme, you know. Majority of the times, I like the second pose that I would make after pushing it, you know. Sometimes I wouldn't like it. Sometimes I just go back to what I drew originally because the extremes is just doing too much. But most of the time after pushing it, I would like the extreme more than my first attempt. Now the second tip is more of a drill, you know. I would actually go on the internet, go on Pinterest and search up these dynamic poses, and without spending too much time on each pose, I would just roughly draw them down. A lot of gesture drawing, you know, keeping those three things in mind: the line of action, the hip placement, the shoulder placement, and the construction of the whole pose with the triangles. I usually like to construct the whole pose with the triangle, keeping that flow of energy, keeping that line of action in mind, and also the placement of the hips and the shoulders. Doing this, if you keep on doing this over and over and over, keeping the three things in mind, practicing over and over and over, you should be on your way to drawing dynamic poses by accident. And with that, we have come to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to drop a like. And once again, for the third time, hit the subscribe button. I can see you haven't. Hit the subscribe button if you have not, to join the Double Empire. Make sure that you're here for the next tutorial, because in the next tutorial I'm going to show you how to add a little foreshortening to these dynamic poses. You just make them look beautiful, you know what I'm saying? So make sure you hit that subscribe button, and make sure also to hit that bell. Lately it hasn't really been working. You hit the bell, you haven't been notified. I don't know what's up with YouTube, but hit that bell. It's a low chance, but there's never a zero chance of you getting the video. So hit the subscribe button, hit that bell. Make sure to check me out on my IG and my Twitter as well. That rhymes. In the description is where they are linked. God bless, and until next time, Double M out.